主要的除了他的研究呢之外呢，他也非常的花了很多的这个努力在协助原住民族部落的培力和资源的治理。那他同时呢也获得这个澳洲的一个最高的一个荣誉啊，那就是澳洲国家最高荣誉奖的 Order of Australia， 以及呢澳洲国际地理学奖章 Australian International Medal 啊，是Institute of Australian Geographers 啊，是澳洲的最高的地理学奖章。同时，他也曾经获得正义与和平的荣誉奖章。以及呢，目前呢，他一直在进行在 Macquarie 和 Roy Futures Partnership， 也就是大学与社区未来伙伴关系的一个理事会还是主席啊。那我们也因为他的这样优异的这个经验和他的学术的地位，因此能够申请教育部的玉山学者，并且获聘为教育部玉山学者，以及呢我们台师大的地理学系讲座教授，非常荣幸啊，所以邀请他来有系列讲座。那今天呢，我们还有2位年轻学者呢，会来协助我们对这门课的进行，2位语坛人啊。首先我们在Howitt教授的演讲之后呢，我们会邀请吴怡锦博士啊，他来为大家有一个中文的诠释啊。那也协助，因为今天有很多修课的同学协助大家的理解。吴怡锦博士他是英国的Sussex 也就是我们叫Sussex University 的发展学的博士，所以那他在大学的时候也是有台大森林系的学士学位啊，同时到英国进修，那也有非常丰富的原住民族部落参与的经验。那今天也特别再邀请另外一位语坛者是由国立东华大学族群关系与文化对不起，国立东华大学这个多元文化研究所以及教育与潜能开发学系的助理教授张盈之博士。那张盈之呢，他也是Howitt 教授的高徒啊，他的博士从这个澳洲的 Macquarie University 以及东华大学族群关系研究所的一个双联博士学位。他也曾经在美国的 University of Memphis 得过硕士学位，以及 University of Oregon 的数学与哲学双主修学士所以2位年轻学者都是资历非常的优异那今天来参与呢，我们和也协助大家呢和这个我们的玉山学者 Professor Howitt 的这个对谈以及诠释。好，那我们接下来呢，我们就特别热烈的掌声来欢迎 Professor Howitt give your lecture。
Thank you all for being here again, and thank you for our new friends. You're very welcome to Debbie, but I should say that I'm really honoured to speak to a larger audience, but in some ways I still think of myself as my elementary school students used to call me Teacher Richie. I do want to make sure that this lecture is part of a lecture series to the students in Indigenous community conservation. So I want to I won't speak quicker, but I do want to try and make sure there is time for a conversation to develop with the students and for us to hear the questions from the students as well as everybody else. And I know I'm here for only a short time, so being able to have that conversation with the students and for you to connect to the work that I'm doing is quite important, because you're the future, we hope. We hope there's a future and we hope you're part of it. So, the other thing I want to say is that in the lecture slides I do provide a bunch of references that I'm drawing on. And sometimes the slides will go quickly, but I think the slides are accessible to everybody. If you're having trouble accessing any of the references, please let me know and I'll try to make sure they're accessible to you as well. So, let's go. What am I talking about today? I'm talking about coupled human and natural systems, which is part of the science-based dialogue about the human-nature relationship that I'm going to call it Western science, although I'm uncomfortable with those big labels of East, West, white, Indigenous and so on, and I've tried to challenge those ideas in the first lectures. So I'm going to use the label dominant thinking or hegemonic thinking, the thinking that comes not just from the colonizer as an idea, but from the experience of colonizing. So last week I talked about Freire, the Brazilian educator, talking about oppressor, oppressed. Again, we need to sort of deconstruct those big binaries and not get captured into just thinking there's an either or, good, bad, but it's about what the connections and what the consequences of connections and disconnections really are. So, having said Western science, let me immediately problematise that binary as well. But that separation of humanity and nature is really based on a human-centric view of the world, that what gets called human exceptionalism, that humans are different to everything else. Not only different, but it's fair and reasonable to make the world human-centred, for our thinking to be responsible to putting humanity at the centre of all things. So those hegemonic ways of thinking about the world that are embedded in so many of our societal institutions and structures influence not just how we think, but how we act in the world, how we think about the world, what I've talked about as the ontological foundations for being in the world. And they fundamentally influence even how we tackle even the most complex and challenging existential problems that human societies face. And the language that we use, or the languages that we use, both shapes and is shaped by those hegemonic systems. So we often find ourselves speechless in the face of the most complex and challenging problems. And of course, that's because under conditions of globalisation, or what we might think of as the Anthropocene, or there's all sorts of, the Capitalocene is another way of thinking of it. There's all sorts of labels, but in those conditions of globalisation, of settler colonialism, that hegemonic language, that hegemonic thinking, is the language of possession, of markets and profit. And I've already talked about that notion of possession, yeah? That the settler wants to displace, to dispossess in order to possess and occupy. So last week I spent some time trying to encourage people to unthink. Yeah? So part of what I guess I'm focused on is how we think. And we often, as humans, we just think. We don't think about how we think. Yeah? We just take it for granted. So to go from encouraging you to think to encouraging you to start unthinking what you've taken for granted, to unthink what comes from the dominant hegemonic discourse, and to start thinking differently, to start listening differently. Yeah, I think I spoke last week about how we so quickly, as scholars, leap into speaking rather than listening, and that even when we listen, we sometimes listen to the wrong things. So last week I attended Scott Simon's seminar at NTU Anthropology, where his opening question was, who paid any attention to birds on their way to the seminar? So who saw a bird this morning on their way to this lecture? Who talked to a bird? Who listened to a bird? Yeah? What do we listen to? We assume we're in a human-focused environment in the urban setting, and yet I keep asking the trees. Where am I? Keep asking the trees along Hipping Road, how did they get here? Yeah? Because those trees are a really important part of my life. Because where I come from, those trees, the melaleucas, the paperbarks, they've been part of my life forever. And in Darug country, the bark from those trees is used to line the kulamans, the little cradles that we put kids in. Yeah, because it's so soft. So I keep asking those trees, how did you get here? And they haven't told me yet. But the other thing I notice about those trees is that they have really different bugs in the bark here. So the patterns that you see under the bark are really different. So they're having a very different life here in Taipei than the trees that I see at home. And yet they're my brothers and sisters in some really interesting ways. So that was a digression. I keep digressing. I keep disrupting myself, and I apologise. But in unthinking, you have to be ready to listen to the unexpected. So I'm going to try today to look at, so unthinking was the big idea from last week. And I'm trying to look at some other big ideas today to challenge some of the thinking building blocks, the conceptual building blocks that influence how we, human societies, how we, geographers, how we, the students in Indigenous Community Conservation course at NTNU in 2024, how we respond to the challenges of the Anthropocene, to the challenges of this hegemonic disconnection of human and nature into conceptual building blocks that are understood as opposing each other rather than being intermingled. So, my question for today, and one I hope at some point we actually get to come back to my questions about what is expert, who's an expert, what is expertise. Today's question is Indigenous community conservation a form of environmental management? Yeah, so we have this notion, environmental management, resource management, nature conservation, all those labels. My question to the students in the course is the label that your course has a form of environmental management? So, and then the follow-up question is all these other labels that we deal with, co-management, joint management, are they forms of cross-cultural environmental engagement that involve Indigenous people around the world? So co-management is the label that is common in Canada. Joint management is the framework that's often used in Australia. What do we mean when we're talking about those things? So that's my question for you to put away and discuss. Okay. So our much treasured and much missed colleague Debbie Rose asked us to think about the idea of decolonising. Now, I always look at that term, and in English we emphasise that most English speakers know nothing about English grammar. So I hope I'm talking to a really informed group of people who've learned English by learning grammar and know that decolonising is a present participle. Yeah? So my question always to my English-speaking students, and now to you, is what's the tense in decolonising, in that label? Because colonising is also used there as a noun, yeah? So it's a really interesting grammatical structure, and I'm starting with language. What tense is decolonising, do you reckon? Or deep silence greets me. I'm sorry. Oh, thank you. You're a native speaker. You can't answer. So you have to learn grammar.
Yes, it's present tense.
You think it's present tense. Does anybody think it's future tense? Does anybody think it's past tense? Of course it can be all three. And in most Indigenous thinking that I've engaged with, it's this really weird tense for English speakers, which I think of as past, present, future continuous. It's the always was, always will be. And that's what we need to disrupt. Yeah? Decolonising isn't in the past, and it isn't only in the present. It is the ongoing future of the hegemonic approach. Yeah? So every time we use the word decolonising, as Debbie asked us to use it, it's about recognising it's what we do in our institutions. It's what we do in our laws. It's what we do in our well-intentioned decolonising, decolonial activities. It reimposes the hegemonic unless we understand that process of, I'm going to use the word indigenising, but I'm a bit uncomfortable with that as well because it's a bit essentialist and it says, oh, they are the other and it's their turn, and that's not my understanding of what decolonial, or if I go to the past, present, future, continuous decolonising, it's not what the responsibility is to simply flip to another hegemony. It's actually to tackle the process of hegemony, however I say that word. I'm a mere English speaker, I don't know everything about English. So, Debbie asked us to think about decolonising. The ways in which the everyday activities of the hegemonic powers of the colonial continue to colonise, continue to dispossess, continue to assert possession, erasure of others. Even when they claim or aim or intend to overcome Indigenous disadvantage. So if I take the word self-determination, I have worked with so many colleagues who have told, let me be careful how I label this. Are there any lawyers in the room? There might be some anthropologists. I have worked with many colleagues of undisclosed disciplinary backgrounds who have said, let us get on with it because we will give you self-determination. You'll have, this will secure, whatever we're doing, whether it's making a land claim, negotiating a mining agreement, that the experts have said, we will give you self-determination through this process. But the process has excluded people from making decisions. It's excluded them as even being possible decision makers. It's excluded them as being experts in their own cultures. I've heard lawyers say to people, you can't say that, it doesn't fit the native title legislation in Australia. So you can't represent your culture as you understand it, you have to represent it the way I tell you to. Because I'm the expert. And the law, the courts will only listen to experts. Okay? Which I just find remarkable. The hegemonic arrogance, oh, there's a good thing to write down and underline. The hegemonic arrogance of expertise. And we are scholars, students, we are embedded in that hegemonic arrogance. And if we don't see it, we will reproduce it because it is decolonising in its processes. Sorry, I think that was another distraction. Let me get to the end of this slide. So, what I want to say, the reason I want to grapple with all of this is that this colonial insistence that creates laws, that imports laws into space and makes them the binding framework through which people are allowed to exist, to identify as being able to exist, that regulates the exploitation of what gets labelled as natural resources, that regulates how we respond to natural disasters, that create property, that erase any elements of pre-colonial laws or rights, that says anything that survived conquest doesn't really exist because after conquest everything changes. So what gets hidden in that deep colonising is the way that there are conceptual building blocks that settler colonialism relies on in order to claim the thinking space, in order to claim thinking. And that's what I want to undo. Because for us to listen, for the inheritors of hegemony, and we are all influenced, captured to some extent. For us to be able to listen differently, we actually have to recognise what has captured us. That's our first step along this path. So, my colleague Sandy Suchet-Pearson and I have rattled on about this for a long time, and we've used the label ontological pluralism to try and capture that there genuinely are different ways of understanding what the world is, who we are, where we fit. And drawing on my colleague from Charles Darwin University, Michael Christie, I could tell lots of interesting stories, and I'll probably get distracted at some stage. But drawing on Michael Christie's work, he talks about Yolngu knowledge in northeast Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory of Australia, talks about Yolngu knowledge systems as being ex-centric. Not eccentric as in E-double-C-E-N-T-R-I-C, but EX, not having a centre. Yeah? That everything has agency. Everything has sentience. Everything can do stuff. So the human is not at the centre of things. The human is co-equal with everything else. Different way of thinking of the world, I have to say. And he talks about, here you go, I'm getting distracted. He talks about the difficulty of learning the language of that people, where every time he thought he had the word, somebody would use another one that depended on context. And one thing that he worked out is that in an ex-centric system, he couldn't even find a word that translated some of the big categories that he took for granted as an English-speaking person, like plant or animal. Yeah? We see this ontological divide between plants and animals. You can't be both. No. Of course you can be both. Yeah. If you eat plants or animals, you've got plants or animals as part of you already. So you have to just grapple with this. Like we think inside and outside are really separate. Yeah? Where, if we just go down to the scale of an individual person, everybody just look at your hand and tell me where the boundary between you and the outside world is. And if you get down to a sort of atomic level, scale, then what you know is there is no boundary. Yeah? Everything is diffused and connected. Yeah? If I think about inside and outside, what's inside your gut? The outside world. Yeah? Directly connected to the outside world. And yet we think that's inside. So suddenly we have to think really differently in beginning to think about how we put these things together. So we've talked about this ontological pluralism in trying to grapple with how do we make sense of very different worldviews. What we've argued is that there are deeply flawed conceptual building blocks underpinning the hegemonic view of the world, and that one of those deeply flawed building blocks is the word management, especially when it has the adjective environmental in front, because it claims that humanity is able to exercise management over the non-human. That is an anthropocentric view of the world that says that the capacity to control sits with humanity. Okay? That's what environmental management asserts. We can manage. So, the colonisers' view of their own superiority leads us to categorise all sorts of things as capable of being managed, capable of being overseen and controlled, more or less than us. And it separates the human and nature as categorically distinct domains, even though, even in the scientific view of the world, when we get to a certain scale, there is no difference. Yeah? The molecules that form us form lots of other things. We're made up of rubbish from all sorts of places. And we will become rubbish that forms other stuff at some stage. Yeah? And lots of humans get uncomfortable thinking they're not so special. Yeah? Because we want to be. We want to be significant. I don't know why. So, in that hegemonic view where there are things to be managed and controlled, nature, wildlife, minerals, landscapes, wild humans are constructed as resources to serve somebody else's agenda. a scientific, a conservationist, a developmentalist, or a capitalistic agenda. But as I've said, I've preempted this slide now. I forgot Michael was in here already. That lots of Indigenous knowledge systems are themselves grounded and eccentric. Yeah, they're linked to place. They're linked to a view of the world that doesn't put people, any people, let alone themselves, at the centre of the universe. So there's an English word that I assume comes from the Greek, of androcentrism. What's nice about that is that because the Greeks were so sexist, they thought the andros, the male, was everybody. So when we talk about androcentrism, we can talk about human and male-centred in one word. So in addition to challenging the androcentric notion of managing the environment, the work that Sandy and I have done together has really tried to challenge a whole lot of big words in the management systems of the hegemonic. Things like planning. Yeah? We love planning. In fact, geographers and planners are often sitting together in the same department. And, you know, we often have urban planning. And I walk out into these cities that we live in. I think, who on earth planned this? Yeah? And yet planners think they have. But they won't take responsibility for the chaos, yeah? For the madness, for the amount of concrete that we've imposed on the environments, for the insistence that we can't actually pay attention to birds because we've got to pay attention to these big vehicles that are heading our way rather than the little birds that are talking to us. Institutional strengthening. Don't we love it? We will invest in building institutions and strengthening their capacity to manage. And capacity building. Are there any people who work in Indigenous organisations that have been subjected to capacity building? Always. And why is it that Indigenous groups' capacity needs building, but government agencies and hegemonic institutions whose capacity to see, think, hear is zero, let's give it a label, whose intercultural capacity is actually a capacity deficit. So we use the language capacity deficits. We look for where are the capacity deficits. And so when do we begin to start doing capacity building in these incompetent organisations that are hegemonically imposing themselves? And in those organisations I include researchers and academic disciplines, not just colonising agencies that are obviously colonising, but it's us. Yeah? We scholars, we teachers, hence my opening statement about we need to hear the students, we need to reflect on this stuff as well. So, drawing on Michael's work, where he talks about this eccentric view of the world, we can begin to build different ways of understanding, different ways into this problem. Because as Christie says, Indigenous knowledge makes possible the routine practices of everyday life. Yeah? People rely on their own understanding to get through the days and years that they live on the planet. So it's pretty effective knowledge. Indigenous knowledge is performative. It's something you do rather than something you have. That the traditions differ from place to place. So there's no singular indigenous knowledge that we can go and extract stuff from. It's different everywhere. So to start with, you have to listen. Indigenous knowledges are owned. Yeah, they're not scholars to go and take, or by documenting them. We don't know them. We have to continue to have an ethical relationship which seeks permission, which acknowledges ownership, which engages in being held accountable for having that knowledge. It's collective. So we can't go to one person and say, oh, it's all right to use this way, isn't it? Yeah? And yet, that's the simple way we get consent. How do our research committees ask us to construct consent? It's about an individual consent process. Free, prior and informed consent processes come down to some sort of documentation that somebody's signed off on something. And yet, how do we know the conditions of consent? Indigenous knowledges are often, but not always, protected and accountable through socially constructed systems of what in Australian context get called managers or caretakers. Now the use of those, this is Michael's working in Yolngu systems. So in Yolngu, the use of these two terms is very deliberate because the managers hold the caretakers accountable and the caretakers hold the managers accountable. So somebody's always checking up on you. The system of checks and balances that says nobody's got the right to make a decision without involving everybody. Yeah? And Indigenous knowledges are responsive, active and constantly renewed and reconfigured. So Indigenous knowledges don't belong in the past. They are as contemporary and as powerfully peer-reviewed as any knowledge we have in the university. Yeah? I would say the most rigorous peer review I ever received is in presenting material to Indigenous communities. And if you present it in the way that it should be presented, that you're being held accountable, then rest assured it is really, really strongly peer reviewed. Okay, so are we dealing with disentangling or understanding entanglement? So there is this, it's not a hegemonic discourse because they think they're being liberatory. They think they're being innovative in talking about coupled human and natural systems. It even gets the acronym CHANS, coupled human and natural systems. So even if we think in terms of coupled systems or systems that are separate but entangled, we're maintaining that label human as part of how we begin to think about this entanglement. And it seems to me that that remains too human-centred to really understand and work with self-governance. Yeah? If we take, I started this lecture series with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and emphasised the importance of self-determination and self-governance. But what do we mean by self-governance when it comes to thinking about environmental relationality? Yeah? Do we mean we give the right to Indigenous groups to exercise hegemonic management, control of environment? Or do we need to think something different? Our disciplines, I work as a geographer, our disciplines are so captured by the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene didn't exist as a keyword. Who understands keywords? Yeah? When you go and do a keyword search, and you look for the keyword Anthropocene, I urge all students to do it. and see what comes up, because nothing will come up before 2005. Yeah? Nobody thought, well, a couple of people did, but there were very few thinkers talking about Anthropocene prior to 2005. If you look, there will be tens of thousands of scholarly papers about the Anthropocene since 2015. Yeah, suddenly it's a buzzword. No, sorry, technical solution, keyword. So if you understand how keywords work, they come into the scientific vocabulary, and suddenly everybody has to write a paper about the Anthropocene. And because we have to write papers, everybody puts Anthropocene in as a keyword, whether they are dealing with these issues or not. So we're captured by the Anthropocene. But as long as we're captured by the Anthropocene, we end up, so we've got Anthropos in there, humanity. We end up, even when we're thinking about this problematic relationship, we end up thinking about the Anthropos as separate to the ethos, human nature. We inherit it from the Greeks. Don't blame the contemporary Greeks. The ancient Greeks made this separation, but so did a lot of others on their pathway to being dominant hegemons. So, my experience from my Indigenous mentors is that the principles of self-government are very different to hegemonic ideas of protected areas, or wilderness, or joint management or co-management. Yeah? That self-governance has to be thought differently than the conditions on which the hegemonic allows. Yeah? That what the hegemon thinks of as self-governance is still the process of government. Yeah? So we get into all that Foucauldian stuff about governmentality and governance. And we realise, oh, there's a game that I used to play with my students called Bullshit Bingo. Does anybody play Bullshit Bingo in Taiwan? So, I talked about buzzwords. Yeah? And there's all these buzzwords, so you should have buzzwords like Anthropocene, for me, hegemonic, you'll get the idea. And you have a little list, and when the lecturer has used all those buzzwords in one lecture, you stand up and say, bullshit! Yeah, you call it out. Yeah, because we do talk in all those buzzwords. We have to sort of really tackle this. And now, there's a bunch of buzzwords in that slide that we hear over and over again in our courses on environmental geographies or environmental management or conservation or ecology or anthropology or all sorts of places. So, if we start listening to the systems that we're entangled in, and where do we are entangled, where do we disconnect, connect? It's that stuff about where's the edge between us and everything else. And if we start allowing adaptations that stop well-intentioned, deep colonising, and start supporting less human-centred, less globalised, less profit-focused relationalities, then maybe that's a thought experiment that we can begin to play with. How do we unthink this stuff? How do we begin to unthink the settler colonisation that we're entangled in? Yeah? So the coupled human natural systems thinking often is thinking about what parts of nature we're entangled in rather than what parts of human systems we're entangled in. How are we... It's not how do we impose, it's not just how do we, human systems, impose on natural systems. It's how are we captured and dominated by hegemonic human systems. So, I did start with the United Nations Declaration. I will remind us all that colonising is gendered as well as racialised. And the way that language works, the Indigenous is always out of time and out of place, or it's in the wrong time or the wrong place. Yeah? So Indigenous Australians are constantly told what's called the authenticity discourse, that they can't be really Aboriginal because the real Aborigines were somewhere else or somewhere else. Yeah? You can't be here and you can't be now. And yet my experience is the Aboriginal colleagues I work with are all in the here and now. They're not somewhere or someone else. They're as contemporary in their thinking as I am, and often way ahead of my thinking. But I'm an expert. I shouldn't admit that, should I? Yeah? Of course I'm not expert. I have some skills, I have some knowledge, I have some experience. But in the co-creation of understanding, yeah, this is teacher Richie again, not expert Richie, that teacher Richie is a learner. Yeah, that he learns along the way of having something to teach. And if I stop learning, if I stop listening, then what have I got to teach? Yeah? What new understanding is being built? And we need we know we need new understanding because the systems that we're entangled with are failing. So, where did I get to? Who's this guy out the front who keeps disrupting me? So, what we see is that very notion of Indigenous people being in the wrong place or the wrong time is part of the way that Indigenous groups are disciplined by the colonising society, because they're allowed to exist on the condition they don't disrupt things. Yeah? You can have rights to a place so long as you manage it the way we tell you to. Yeah? That's the principle of joint management. You don't get self-governance. We'll let you have the property title, but you have to lease it back to a national park. You have to develop a plan of management that is consistent with ecological principles. Yeah? You have to have scientists on your board of management. Yeah? That's what joint management means. It doesn't mean self-governance or self-determination. So, back to Debbie's term of deep colonising. Deep colonising is, present tense, is very active in this chosen topic area of Indigenous community conservation. So we have to have our bullshit detectors really open and working in order to be able to recognise it. Where is decolonising happening in these systems that we aspire to be part of because we want to be decolonial, because we want to support Indigenous community conservation, because we care about nature? Okay? If we don't have our bullshit detectors working, then we'll become part of the bullshit so easily. Okay? You need to be ready to listen, to hear. So, as I said, while the UNDRIP established people's collective rights to self-determination and self-governance, that terminology for that in our field uses exactly the same decolonising building blocks as we've always been using. We talk about conservation, we talk about management. So how do we begin to think outside the decolonising box? And see, I anticipated this little footnote here already, I've said that, which is about what tense that word is. So can we begin to find, build language and ways of working that avoid being captured into the deep colonising work that all of that institutional strengthening and capacity building and managing and education does. Yeah? Is there a way to stop reinforcing and recentering our own practices and concepts within the constraints of what Debbie talked about as the hall of mirrors, where that globalising, essentialising discourse of both colonial and post-colonial narratives that gets centred on the colonial, is there a way of escaping that? Now, I used to think for a while that this was the way out, yeah, of talking about coupled human and natural systems, because it acknowledged that these things were together. And Howitt's seminal paper on the science of coupled human and natural systems builds on, but it does actually move beyond the disciplinary-based work in human ecology, ecological anthropology, environmental geographies and so on. But they made these points. Coupled human and natural systems research focus on patterns and processes that link human and natural systems. I've already anticipated that they keep them sort of conceptually separate. That it emphasises reciprocal interactions and feedbacks, both the effects of humans on environment and environments on humans, and that it seeks to understand within scale and cross-scale interactions between human and natural components of systems. Now, each of these three aspects has been addressed in some aspects of human-environment interaction research, but the science of CHANS, the coupled human and natural systems research, promotes integration. But after being a bit enamoured since reading this stuff 15 years ago, it seems to me that this coupled human and natural systems research still falls short of ontological integration that underpins this sort of integration that underpins first knowledges. That where in first knowledge systems, kinship, connection, and the agency of place and nature is recognised, it's accepted. It's not seen as somehow separate. So, I come back to those questions that I've posed. Is Indigenous community conservation a form of environmental management that keeps that human nature distinction in a way that is dismissive or puts into an inferior position Indigenous knowledges? Are those forms that we see in negotiated settlements about recognition of the Indigenous, like joint management and co-management, or state overseen management, are they consistent with the rights that are imagined in the UNDRIP? And back to my opening question, who are the experts and what constitutes expertise when we come to these systems? I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. 好，为他做了简单的摘要。不过，其实今天老师在一开始的时候就有提到说，他其实今天希望今天这个场合，因为这毕竟是一门我们是有一门课叫社区保育，原住民社区保育，所以其实希望今天可以多留一些时间，鼓励同学们发问，那也可以跟同学们有一些对话。那所以我尽量也将我的摘要今天稍微简短一点，然后希望今天也有很多在场的同学跟老师，就是希望大家可以做一些后续的讨论。那其实老师在上周是提醒大家说，我们对于我们接受到的知识概念要保持一个批判的反思。那这个礼拜他就比较回到就是这门课的主题——原住民社区保育这件事情，来去提醒我们去思考说，那这个名词背后的它的意涵是什么？那我觉得同样的它的目的都不是在于要给大家一个很明确的答案， 而是希望可以去大家引发更多的批判跟思考。那今天他其实主要就要去谈的就是我们要去思考人跟自然的关系到底怎么在科学的系统里面被讨论，然后他试图想要去挑战这个现在主流社会很多谈这个东西这个关系的这个概念的想法。那再来就是说，其实上周他有提到，其实有一个很有问题，在我们现在主流的论述里面很有问题的，就是一个二元的分法，就是对于错好与坏啊，甚至是压迫者、被压迫者，他一直强调一件事情，从第一堂课到现在，他一直在强调的一个重点，就是我们去思考是各个系统之间的关系，而不是说要去把它去区分为一个好像对立的位置这样。所以他今天其实也不想要去轻易的去贴上什么西方科学知识这种标签，或者原住民知识这种标签。那他比较是把就是所谓的西方科学知识成为一个主流的思想或是霸权这样。那在一开始他就是去问大家一个很大的问题，就是原住民社区保育是不是就等同于环境管理？因为我们目前的其实人文社会思想其实还是非常以人为中心。那他今天其实一直在挑战这个东西，就是说我们要跳脱出这个以人为中心的思想框架。那所以其实上有一个东西要提到有很重要的东西，就是语言这个东西其实影响了我们怎么去思考事情。因为语言这个东西它其实是被整个主流的体系所形塑，然后同时它又再去重新形塑主流的体系。所以这些文字啊，我们使用的文字，我们使用的语言，它其实常都是有它背后的一些概念在的，或者是它背后的一些预设在的。譬如说，在全球化、在可殖民主义的脉络下面，我们使用的语言，它背后的意涵，常常是关于占有，然后或是关于市场，然后或者是关于利益的。然后再来就是他就提到说，就再次提醒大家，就是我们常常都是去思考，但是我们不会去思考我们是怎么思考的。所以他其实就是提醒我们要去思考我们是怎么运用这些我们视为理所当然的文字或者是想法，然后去思考我们怎么建立这些文字跟思考。那尤其是身为学者，他其实一样，从第一堂他一直到强调到现在，我们有个很重要的要做的事情是去倾听，因为我们通常当学者，我们常常是习惯去讲话，而不是去倾听。然后我们如果要做到他提到的那个 unthinking， 就是去再思考或去思考的话，我们要习惯于去倾听我们不习惯的那些声音，就是这些我们不习惯的声音，其实反而是可以引发我们很多的反思跟思考的。好，那所以再来就是他就去问到今天其实最重要的一个问题，就是他在问的原住民社区保育是否是一个环境管理的形式，以及我们常常在使用的这些，在谈到环境管理的时候常用到的这些共管、联合管理，它在这个跨文化的跨文化环境的处境里面，它是不是它代表的是一个什么样的意义？然后它就是是否是一个我们可以认知的原住民的环境管理的形式。然后那回到就是他今天有一直用到的一个名词就是 building blocks。那 building blocks 就是我们在盖房子的时候，下面那个做基底的那个石头，就是一个好像我们的思考基石，就是我们思考但是奠基在怎么样的基础概念之上的。那在谈到这个东西的时候，他就去提到了他的同事Debbie Rose 在谈到的这个深度殖民然后这边他就去问大家说，深度殖民这个在英文是 deep colonizing， 它到底是过去式、现在进行式还是未来式？那他提到在他的经验上，他觉得这个是它同时是过去式、是现在进行式，它也是一个未来式。那这个其实是我们在做这个去殖民或解殖民这件事情的时候，我们要打破的一个情形。那这 deep colonizing 他在谈的就是说，我们其实现在在制度中所有的过程、政策跟制度，其实它结构它其实都还是一个殖民的过程。那即便说这个殖民的过程好像可能国家政府会用一个说我们是为了要去解决原住民的弱势处境来做这些事，可是其实它根深蒂固的还是一个殖民的现象。好，然后再来就是他后面的几章就都是其实去谈到他跟他的一些同事在一起谈的一些事情，或者是其他的研究者在谈的一些概念。那我先按照他的那个 slide 的顺序来谈的话，他第一个谈到的是 也是跟他的同事在谈说，其实，在人跟人之间，还有人跟环境之间的关系，其实现在主流社会上存在的是一个非常有问题的一些预设想法，就是说，那其中一个最有问题的预设想法就是这个管理的概念 （management 的概念），因为它暗示着说人是有能力控制或管理非人类的社会，所以也就是说，所有的东西它都是可以被管理跟被我们人控制的，而且它把人跟自然视为是分离的范畴。那为什么要这样做呢？因为这样其实是好像是可以，因为把人隔离出来，好像建立了一个人类自己的优越感。那这个是非常有问题的一个概念哦，就是这个以人为中心的想法。然后甚至这个自然界的所有一切的不管是植物啊、动物也好，或者是人类，都是被视为是好像是服务于科学家、服务于保育员，或者是发展工作者或者资本主义的一个资源。那另外，在接下来他就去用了另外一个学者，他在某一个族群的，我不会念的这个族群的名字，就是他们做的一个研究。那他这个研究中其实就谈到这个族群，它有一个去中心的概念，就是 ex-centric， 也就是说，没有是什么东西是为中心的，没有以人为中心这件事情，也没有什么其他为中心的事情，所有东西都是有感知的，而且所有东西也都可以成为一个中心这样。那这边的话就是讲说，其实原住民知识体系通常都是以地方为基础的，它不是以任何的，就是不是以人为中心。那在好像我们比较主流的，其实还是思想上，其实还是非常的以人类跟男性主义为中心，还不是只是以人为中心而已，是还有以男性为中心的一个中心主义。那我们的管理环境的想法，其实就是基本上还是存在于这样子的基本概念。然后，所以他也觉得我们要去挑战很多我们现在常在习惯的一些工具用词，就譬如说 planning 啊，规划，这个常是在地理学中被使用的，或者是体制的强化 institutional strengthening， 或者是能力建构 capacity building， 这是我们非常常在 NGO 里面去听到或者被要求要做的一件事情。那这边就提出一个问题，就是为什么原住民的能力需要被建构？那政府部门呢，或者是主流的机构呢，其实很明显，这些我们的政府跟主流部门，其实我们的文化学习能力都是不足的。那这代表了一个什么样的权力关系？而这个部分反而是没有被挑战的，这样。好，然后再来就是回到刚刚那个Michael Christie 的研究，他根据他那一组的研究，他去帮原住民知识做了一些基本的简单的概述，就是说。原住民知识它其实是非常有表现性的，它就是一个你所做的事情，它不是你拥有的东西。那原住民传统也是因地而异，所以没有一个所谓的单一的知识系统，每个地方都不一样。所以我们到了每一个地方的面对原住民知识系统的时候，我们都要去重新学习跟倾听。那在原住民知识它是属于被拥有的，那这个概念就会又去牵涉到我们对于研究伦理的认知，也就是说。我们没有办法说，只是说去收集这些资料、记录这些资料，我们就宣称说那个是我们的知识了，因为这些知识是属于在地，它是被在地所拥有的。那再来，原住民知识它是集体的，所以我也没有办法说，我只去访问一个人，去收集他的资料，我就说这个东西叫做原住民知识。它其实需要经过一个集体同意的过程，去认可说这个是一个原住民的他们的知识体系。那再来是，它通常。也都是比较回应性的，回应现在的现况的，而且是相当活跃的，所以它会不断的被更新跟重新建构。所以原住民知识它不是存在于过去的，它是存在于现在，而且它会不断的经过被检验的一个过程，才会继续存留下来。这样。好，然后再来是他就去提到说去思考，其实今天的那个就是今天的演讲主题就是那个 chance， 就是 coupled human and natural systems， 对，就是他就是刚刚提到，其实主流的社会或者主流的科学在思考人与环境关系的时候，其实跟原住民在思考人与环境关系是有一些差异的。那在10几年前，他开始接触到这个所谓的 chance 的时候，他觉得好像这个可能是一个很创新的想法，可以就是来去思考人跟环境之间的关系。但他后来发现说，其实这个 chance 的讨论的方式，它其实还是过于以人为中心。那这样子的思考方式，其实没有办法让我们将原住民自治的思维是放在这个环境关系里面的。 然后所以他这边就提出了问题了，就是说这个其实让我们去思考到底什么是自治，就是我们在谈这个环境管理这件事情的时候，到底什么是自治？我们只是给予原住民一个权利，说他们可以运用主流的管理方式来去进行环境资源管理吗？然后还是说我们是真的给他一个空间去进行他们自己的用他们自己的方式来去做所谓的环境管理这件事情，这样。好，然后再来他就再次的提醒就是说，在我们讨论原住民社区保育的时候，这个自治的概念其实跟自治的概念跟我们在讨论原住民社区保育里面用的这些保护区啊、荒野啊、联合管理、共管这些概念其实是很有差异的。那他就再次提醒我们，都要永远要一直不断去提醒自己，要去思考这些 buzzword， 就是这些很噱头，好像很有就是一个噱头的名词，或者是流行的行话，它背后到底是一个什么样的东西？不是我们就全盘的接收。然后这边就举一个例子，他说他很常在课堂上就是跟学生玩一个游戏叫 bullshit bingo， 就是说如果他在课堂上，他如果就是有人用了这些buzzword这些流行行话的时候，同学就要举手说 bullshit 这样。然后所以他就是要提醒大家，我们要非常小心的使用，或者是就是要去思考这些行话它后面到底是什么意涵这样。那再来最后其实就是提到这个自治的概念，因为自治的概念其实就是回应了那个原住民他在第一堂课谈的联合原住民族权利宣言，其实就是去保障了原住民的自治的权利。那其实在殖民它其实是有性别跟种族的特性的就回应到刚刚的那个就是非常以人然后以男性为中心的这个中心主义那所以他就是在这边就是讲到说，其实基本上在主流社会上，原住民他好像永远都是出现在错误的时间跟地点，他都不属于此刻或此地的，他都不是属于现在的。那甚至原住民存在的条件就是不能扰乱那个殖民的思想论述，所以又回应到刚刚其实他在谈，就是说我们给予原住民说所谓的共管的权利的时候，我们到底给予的是什么样的东西？我们只是要他要符合我们的规则或原则来去。所以我们才会给他权利，还是我们真的有给他权利跟空间，去执行他们想要的方式，去真的把把权利下放给原住民这样。好，然后对，那再来就是其实后面其实也是类似的就是不断去强调说要去思考保育跟管理这些术语，它后面的概念，基本的概念到底是什么？然后再来说，我们有没有办法开始跳脱出这个深度殖民这个 decolonizing 的框架来去思考，然后甚至找到其他的语言跟工作方式来去避免再次强化或者再中心化这个殖民的实践跟概念这样。那就他觉得说，就是刚刚讲到那个 chance， 他曾经觉得这个可能是一个方法，就是它是一个以科学为基础的尝试来去挑战人跟自然的关系。但是他后来在10几年后再重新回头去看这些东西的时候，他发现其实这个东西还是非常以人为中心的。那即便说这个 chance 的科学，它其实已经尝试去把各个不同的面向，包括人跟自然的连结的模式跟过程，或者是那个人跟环境互相的反馈作用，就是怎么互相影响的，以及那个人跟自然之间一些跨尺度跟尺度内部的互动作用，都已经尝试比较多面向、比较全面的去把它整合起来了。可是他觉得这个 chance 的研究其实还是终归再回去看原住民知识系统的时候，这个 chance 的科学还是没有办法像原住民知识系统那样的，好像是一个比较多样的本体论的存在来去肯认跟处理像亲缘关系啊，或者是各个系统之间的连结啊，甚至是地方跟自然的能动性跟感知，就是说这些地方跟自然它有它自己的能动性跟感知。那 chance 它基本上还是非常以人中心的，没有办法去肯认这件事情的，还没有办法做到这件事情啊，这样。好，那最后就是他就是回到那个几个大问题要去思考，就是到底原住民社区保育是不是一个环境管理形式？那再来就是第一堂到第二堂到第三堂，他不断在问大家到底谁是专家，以及这些专业知识的基础是什么？好，那这个大概是今天的摘要。
好，谢谢。接下来以专业的方式为大家